We'll go ahead and get started. Before I hand things over to Lori Reed, I wanted to do a couple of housekeeping items. This is our second installment for the 2019 Tree Board webinar series. There's a bug in my tree. So I'm very excited to have Lori Reed as our presenter for today's webinar. She is an excellent resource and has become a good friend of mine over the years of working with her. Lori is the Assistant City Arborist for the City of Charlotte, where she is responsible for administering the neighborhood tree planting program and enforcing the city's tree ordinance as it relates to the right-of-way trees. She holds a BS, or bachelor's and a master's in entomology from Clemson University, and is an ISA certified arborist and holds an ISA track qualification as well. So she's very knowledgeable, and she's going to share some of her expertise with us today on pests for urban trees. And with that, I will hand it over to you, Lori.
All right. Thanks, Leslie. And thank you for asking me to do this webinar, and for everyone that's here, thanks for joining. I love talking about insects, and I like talking about trees, and so it's a good combination to talk about this topic. Like Leslie said, if you have questions, feel free to put it in the chat, and we can get to it at the end. At the end of my presentation, I also have my email address. So if you feel like you need to send me an email or ask questions later, that's perfectly fine too. So we'll just jump right in. One of the things I always like, there we go. When we talk about trees and insects, we're really diagnosing a problem that's going on with those trees. Sometimes it can be difficult. Sometimes you can go up to the tree, you can see the insect, or you can see the damage it causes, and it's really obvious. Sometimes it's not very clear. There's a lot of symptoms that a tree has that look similar to just like a urban stress problem, a tree that's in drought stress, or a tree that has too much water sometimes looks the same as a tree that has, oh, I'm sorry?
Oh, sorry, we're going to go to mute.
Oh. Okay, sorry. A tree that might have like a root rot problem might exhibit some of the same type of symptoms. So sometimes you do have to be a little bit of a detective. Probably the most important thing is to just recognize that something is wrong. Something looks different from that tree. Compare the same species to something in the area or to a different yard, and you might see that something's a little bit off with that tree. And something that's really important too is don't be afraid to consult a professional. I contact people all the time, even other entomologists, if it's something that I've never seen. I dabble in plant pathology and different diseases that affect trees, but I'm not a pathologist by any means. But I talk to other people that know these things really well. One thing I always tell people I work with is don't be afraid to tell people I don't know, but I'll look it up for you, and then follow up with that. Contact someone that knows, that can give you some advice, and that way you can build your knowledge base for issues that may come up in the future. So, one thing that I always have dealt with is, when a tree looks bad, people always want to blame it on an insect or blame it on a disease. A lot of times, most of our native insects are not going to be able to attack a very healthy tree. Those trees have, different types of compounds. They're going to fight off any insects, so they're just not attractive to those insects at all. So there are some reasons sometimes that trees might be attacked by insects or diseases. A tree that's newly planted, or a tree that, B&B tree, ball and burlap tree that you dig up out of a field and move somewhere, that's a really stressful event for that tree. So that's something that might make it susceptible to being attacked. A tree that has a new sun exposure. So there used to be a big oak tree in my front yard, big water oak, and it fell apart, and so it had to come down, and now my other plants that were underneath of it is now in the sun, and they don't want to be in the sun, and they're not very happy right now. Any kind of changes in your environment, like drought or floods, soil compaction, a new house being built, a new sewer line that has to be trenched through by the tree, that can all weaken that tree or make it vulnerable to something to come in to attack it. A lot of times, declining branches or dead trees, material that's down on the ground, that's going to those trees are going to release a lot of different smells. Ethanol is one thing that trees release when they get stressed, and that's very attractive to a lot of different insects. The beetles and stuff might be flying around. They smell that ethanol. The Ambrosia beetles are going to come in and attack that tree because that tree is under some sort of stress. So this is just one example of a tree that was planted here in the city of Charlotte, and this is a black gum tree, and hopefully you can see on this picture all these I'm going to see if I can point to these things, all these girdling roots that are wrapped around that stem right there. Long term, as this tree increases in diameter, those roots are going to increase in diameter. It's going to girdle that tree, and this isn't going to be a tree that is going to be healthy for a really, really long period of time. You know, something like that is really stressful for that tree. And a tree like this was on a site that where I was working as an inspector, and I rejected this tree. I told them they had to take it out and bring back a tree that was healthy. This is another example of girdling roots. This is actually on a pine tree. I used to work for the South Carolina Forestry Commission, diagnosing insect and disease problems, and I had this landowner that was having newly planted pine trees that were just dying in little pockets, and of course they thought beetles were in there killing the tree, and I went and dug up a bunch of the dead trees and found this root structure where these roots are just all crossed over each other and wrapped around that stem, and just really not allowing that tree to be able to live. So definitely causing a problem for that tree. And some trees just have really poor structure. So this is the result of a Bradford pear that had broken out. So some trees, just the way they grow, the branches are just at an angle that they will grow together, and they get included bark in between. And as those two separate stems are growing in diameter, they just force themselves apart. And so this is just an old breakage on a tree. I just thought it was just a really great picture. So sometimes just trees aren't great stock to start with. Talking about preventing any kind of issues, I really like people to think about when they're planting things, plant something that is well adapted to that area. I work with property owners a lot of times, and they always say, well, what kind of tree would you plant here? And assuming you don't have space issues or too close to the house or overhead power or something like that, I like to look around and see what species of trees are growing in that area that seem to be doing well. I have an example here of Tuscarora crepe myrtle. This particular cultivar of tree is resistant to powdery mildew, which crepe myrtles tend to get a lot, or some cultivars get, resistant to Cercospora leaf spot, these little leaf lesions that you can see on these trees, and have a pretty good resistance to crepe myrtle aphids. So, you know, if someone wanted to plant a crepe myrtle at their house, this would be a great cultivar for them to plant there because it's got natural resistance to some major pests that crepe myrtles tend to get. Another good way to prevent is to plant that tree or shrub, really, any kind of plant properly. If you have a balled and burlap tree, you know, remove that burlap as long as, you know, if it's a synthetic. If it's one that's going to break down, maybe, but I still would definitely recommend removing at least half of that. Any girdling roots that might be on that tree, if it has girdling roots, either don't plant it, or if you can snip off some roots and straighten it out, maybe try to baby that tree a little bit. When you're planting, make sure that you can see that root flare on that tree. So where that tree starts getting really wide at the base, you want that at ground level. You don't want to bury those tree roots. Those tree roots need oxygen, so you want to have that there. And like that picture I showed you of the black gum, just don't accept plants that are just in really bad shape. I always love pictures. I was telling Leslie the other day that I have so many pictures of bad trees. I don't really have any great pictures of really nice trees. I need to start taking some more, but good for these kind of conversations that I have pictures of trees in bad shape. So this is a tree that you can see that the burlap is still on that tree, and then these little seatbelt kind of straps are all around that tree as well. Long term, not great for that tree. Not a really good prognosis. That those trees are going to be bound up. They're probably going to be girdled. It's not going to be able to get out, and that tree is just not going to be there for a long period of time. Well, I should erase that. This one right here, this other picture that we have right here, this is that root flare that you want to see. You want to see those nice roots right at the ground line. You don't want them buried really low into the ground. You want those roots at the ground surface. A lot of times plants that come in from container or from the nursery, they might already be buried. There might be 3-4 inches of soil on top of that root flare. You want to dig that out, find that root flare, and put that at that root grade right there. Make sure you water your tree properly. I love mulch around trees for many reasons. One, lawnmowers and weed trimmers can't get into that trunk tissue of the tree where those might rip it up and cause an opening for an insect or disease to be able to get in. Another thing to think about is weed and feed products. The chemical of that weed part can damage some trees. The roots on some trees can take it up, and you can have damage by that as well. If you have dead, diseased, or damaged areas, if it's a limb, you want to go ahead and think about removing that. I always like to remember my 3 Ds for branch removal. And keep up with your trees. Look at them frequently just to know what's going on, to see if there's any new damage or something that you can might need to control. One of my favorite pictures right here is this nice little mulching that we have. This is a community in upstate South Carolina, I guess middle of South Carolina. I used to drive by quite a bit, and they had this really great volcano mulching just built up along that trunk, and year after year. And if you look down the street, you can see a lot of these trees have a lot of top dieback in them. Those roots are just being buried, and they're inside that mulch that's piled up against the trunk of the tree, and it's just trying to grow these roots right here on top of the grass. From that trunk tissue is where those roots are coming from. It's very unhealthy. So when you're looking at trees, you kind of need to know, is what you're seeing really a problem? This is one of my favorite pictures that I love to talk about. This is a pine tree in South Carolina, and I had a homeowner call me because they were convinced they had southern pine beetle in their trees. They saw sap dripping from the tree and little gobs of sap on the side. And when I went out there, I see these perfectly little horizontal oval-shaped holes, and this is caused by a woodpecker called a yellow-bellied sapsucker. They go in, they peck through the tree, the sap comes out, they come back, and they lick the sap off. Doesn't hurt the tree. You can see it on pecan trees and live oaks and hollies. I don't think I've ever seen a decent-sized pecan tree throughout the South that doesn't have some sort of yellow-bellied sapsucker on it. Seen it on Bradford pears. So not hurting the tree, but, it's just something to be aware of. This time of year, I'll often see this little kind of scrambled egg-looking material around trees or in a mulch bed, just growing along the mulch. This particular tree, the mulch was actually piled up to here, which is why you can see this. This is actually a slime mold that's just living on top of the mulch here. It's not hurting the tree. It just looks really, really bad. It looks like it might be something that could damage that tree. But not going to hurt plants, not going to do anything, just going to live right on top of that mulch. And sometimes we find galls on trees. This is an oak apple gall, a wool sower gall, and a pine cone gall. And these are all caused by different types of wasps. The wasp came in and laid her egg on the midrib of this particular leaf, and the plant's reaction is to grow tissue around that and to wall it off. It doesn't hurt the tree long term. That little baby wasp is living right in the middle of this and living on that gall and living on that plant tissue. Same thing with this little pine cone gall. These holes right here are where the adult wasp had come out. These little wool sower galls, I see these on white oaks more often. Each one of these little knobs is a little tiny wasp that's living inside. So pretty neat stuff, but not going to hurt the tree. So I'm an entomologist. I'll stand up for the bugs. Not all insects are going to harm trees. Sometimes they cause an aesthetic issue, maybe because I study insects or maybe I have a really high tolerance. I'm not really sure. But I have a really high tolerance for insects on my trees and on my plants. If my mother-in-law saw my camellias with the amount of T-scales on them, she'd probably be very unhappy with me. But it doesn't bother me. It's not harming the plant overall. I kind of let that go. A lot of insects are secondary. So they're coming in because the tree is under stress or the tree is already declining and is kind of on its way out. If you do want to do any kind of management, it's really important to know the life history of the insect to know when you need to control it. Some insects cause damage only as grubs. So caterpillars, they can damage trees. I'll talk about fall cankerworm. The caterpillars are the ones that are doing the damage to the tree, but we actually will target the female moth for control because she doesn't have wings and we can get to her really easily before she lays her eggs. Some insects are only pests as caterpillars and not as adults. Sometimes the adults are easier to target. Sometimes the larvae are easier to target. So you need to know the life history when it's going to be the most susceptible if you want to do any kind of control. I'll talk a little bit about caterpillars. I love caterpillars. They're pretty cool. Probably see a whole lot of them, and coming up soon, we'll start seeing a lot more as the summer continues on and going into the fall as well. So in Charlotte and other areas of North Carolina, we've had a lot of trouble with cankerworms, especially the fall cankerworm. In Charlotte, we had an outbreak that started in the 80s and 90s and stayed really high levels until about 3 years ago, and our population has recently crashed, which is kind of nice for everyone that lives here. But there are two different types of cankerworms, spring and fall. Their caterpillars are active at the same time of the year. I usually just kind of lump them all together as cankerworms. The females of both of these species are wingless, so that's why she's pretty easy to target. This over here, this is what the female of the fall cankerworm looks like. She's kind of tannish, grayish in color. This is on crepe myrtle tree, so she kind of matches the color of a crepe myrtle bark. They don't have any wings. I think they're a little creepy looking, I'm not going to lie. They're not, pretty like we think a lot of moths are. So they spend, these cankerworms, they will be in the soil as a pupa, which is the stage between the caterpillar and the adult moth. They'll be in the soil all summer, all fall, and most of the winter time. And when we get a really hard freeze, that triggers these moths to come up out of the ground and start looking to lay eggs. The males do have wings. So the females, they climb up out of the ground, climb up on the tree. They release a pheromone, which is a chemical that attracts males. The males come in and mate with the females. She continues to climb up to the top of the tree to lay her eggs. This generally happens, it used to be in December, now it's kind of moving back a little bit later into January is when we've seen them. And each female can lay 100 to 200 eggs, and so they're laid in these masses on the very ends of the branches because those caterpillars are going to eat the leaves of the oak trees. They primarily feed on willow oaks here. They will eat on other things, but they really do prefer willow oaks. So those eggs will hatch right as soon as those buds are breaking. Those leaves are nice and soft tissue, and the caterpillars just eat into that. A couple different color forms. Sometimes they're green. They have these little white, I always call them little racing stripes down the side of their body, or they could be with this black band on the top as well. But they're inchworms, so if you've ever looked at a caterpillar from the side, they generally have these little extra sets. These are called pro legs. They're just little hooks that help them to hang on to things. Inchworms are missing a couple pro legs at the top. So hopefully everyone's seen an inchworm walk. If I was giving this presentation in person, I usually kind of do my little inchworm impersonation with my finger. But, they just kind of inch along on their way. They'll be in masses on trees. Remember, each female can lay 100 to 200 eggs, so they'll all be feeding in groups. They drop down these little silken threads. They get in people's hair. They get down your shirt. When they come down so they can pupate in the soil, to make their pupa in the soil, they'll come down in masses and be moving around. So they're kind of annoying. And, of course, because every animal that eats food has to poop, there's a lot of poop involved with these, which is aggravating as well. But like I said, they really love oak trees. Willow oaks is one of their favorite oak trees. But I've seen them on cherries and dogwoods and Japanese maple. If it's a leaf material that's pretty soft. They'll probably eat it. They're not going to feed on like a holly or a southern magnolia or something like that. They're really waxy and tough leaves. Generally, the caterpillars are active for about 4 or 6 weeks, somewhere in there. And again, like I said, they make their little pupa in the ground, so they climb down from the tree. And when we control these, we put these sticky bands. If you've been to Charlotte or live in Charlotte, you probably see these sticky bands up, usually from the end of November all the way up until the middle of April. We put these on our willow oak trees, and it's just cotton batting wrapped in this plastic material. It's like a saran wrap type of material. And then a tanglefoot is put on top of that. And that tanglefoot is super duper sticky. Anything that walks across it is going to get stuck inside there. So because the female doesn't have wings, that's how we trap her. She walks up the side of the tree, she gets into the sticky tanglefoot material, and she gets stuck, and she can't get up to the top. So we're trying to stop her before she can lay eggs and before we have the caterpillars. And this was a typical band back when we were in pretty high outbreak. All of these dots here are individual female cankerworms, thousands of them on a band by the end of the year. These last 2 years, we've hardly caught any cankerworms, probably in the low thousands, where we might catch, 1,000 or 3,000 on a single band. So it's been interesting. It's been nice for us to live in Charlotte to not have to deal with cankerworm. Another insect that we tend to see on trees, it's generally going to be in the early spring. So if you look at this date, March of, well, it's a long time ago, but the end of March, this is an eastern tent caterpillar. This is the egg mass of the eastern tent caterpillar. It kind of looks like that grate stuff that you spray to close pipes and stuff around the outside of your house. It's kind of that foamy type material. These have hatched. So if you can see all these little tiny holes right here, those are where the caterpillars have hatched out. But the eastern tent caterpillar, I think it's a pretty attractive caterpillar, to be honest with you. It's got these fine little wispy hairs on the side. It's kind of bluish on the side, and it's got this white stripe down the center. I love to play with these as a child, and my kids, whenever we see them, we love to be able to see those as well. But the moth of this caterpillar lays its eggs on cherry trees and crab apples as well, but that's where it's going to lay its trees. And why they're called a tent caterpillar is in the crotch of this cherry tree, it's going to make its tent. So these caterpillars all live together in this little communal tent, and they exit the tent, they go out and feed in the evening and early in the morning and during the night when there's less predators around. This is just a good area for them to be inside this little tent area to be protected by predators. So these webs are always going to be in the crotch of this tree is one easy way to remember this particular eastern tent caterpillar, is that's where it's going to make its tent, is in the crotch of the tree and of cherry trees and crab apples. A cousin of the eastern tent caterpillar is the forest tent caterpillar. This insect, is really more out in the forested areas. Feeds on tupelo, black gum, sweet gum, oak trees. We usually see this in April, so about the same time as the eastern tent caterpillar. Both of these insects just have one generation a year, and a generation is egg to adult. So one time a year, we're going to see all the life stages, and then they're going to be resting. For these particular insects, it's generally as the pupa. For the cankerworms as the pupa. For the two tent caterpillars, the egg mass is what's going to overwinter for those two insects right there. Kind of like the eastern tent, it makes this little foamy mass on the twigs of trees. This is what the adult moth looks like. Kind of generic, nondescript little moth, not large by any size. So this is of Uptown Charlotte on Tryon Street. One of my coworkers said, "Hey, there's a bunch of these cocoons all over near one of the bus stops in Uptown." So all of these little tiny little white things is an individual cocoon of the forest tent caterpillar. So kind of interesting to have this insect that in the forest, this is the kind of damage it'll cause. We generally see it around rivers and streams and stuff. So all of this grayed out area is the feeding damage because they're defoliating. They're eating all the leaves off of these trees in this little swamp right here. This is the damage that they cause out in the forested areas. And this is the damage it caused in uptown Charlotte to one of our willow oak trees. So you can hopefully see right here next to this tree, it has leaves on it. And this tree was almost completely defoliated. By the time I got out there at the beginning of May, it had just started to put out some brand new leaves. So that's really stressful for these trees. You know, they put out leaves for the first time, and these caterpillars are there right as soon as the leaves come out. They eat all those leaves off, and then they got to make leaves again. So it's a little bit stressful for trees. I'm going to skip over bagworms real quick. Fall webworm, this particular insect is out right now. You can start seeing these. The fall is the time that we tend to see the webs a little bit bigger, but they actually also have a spring generation as well. They're like pecans, sourwoods, persimmon, just a little fuzzy little white insect. Lots of hair on it. Sometimes they can be a little bit darker. Sometimes they have really black heads. It's hard to see in this picture. But they make their webs at the very ends of the branches. So if you remember, the eastern tent caterpillar makes its webs in the crotch of cherry trees. The fall webworm makes its webs at the ends of the branches. So easy way to tell the difference between those two. And as these caterpillars grow and continue to eat, that web expands and covers more of that tree. So they're actually eating inside of this little webby area. Orange stripe oakworm, another one that we'll probably start seeing. I usually see this towards the end of the year. This picture was taken in August. But they all feed together. So they feed in one big group. This is on a red oak tree in Abbeville County in South Carolina, and they have eaten everything except for the midrib of these oak leaves. They can do some serious damage. The good news is that caterpillars that defoliate in the fall generally don't cause long-term issues for trees because those trees were going to drop their leaves anyway in the fall. Whereas the caterpillars that are feeding the spring, like the cankerworm and that forest tent caterpillar, it has a little bit more of an impact on a tree because those insects, the cankerworm and the tent caterpillars, are out in the beginning of the year, and that tree needs to regrow leaves to be able to make food all summer long. The ones like the orange stripe oakworm, it feeds in the fall. The trees were going to drop leaves anyway. It's not going to regrow leaves. It's definitely less stressful for that tree. Scales, another really big insect that we see problems on for trees. Scales love stressed plants. If a tree or a shrub is over-fertilized, a lot of times this particular insect will actually have an outbreak in numbers as well. There's lots of natural controls out there that keep these in check, but sometimes management in the form of chemicals is required for these. They can cause yellowing, reduce growth of the tree, and the whole entire tree can become weak. Hopefully everyone's heard of crepe myrtle bark scale. This is a relatively new insect to the United States. It was found in Texas in 2004. It's now found in 12 states, and I'm not sure if all these counties are accurate. There may be more counties in North Carolina where this insect has been found, but out on the coast, kind of the center part of the state, and then Mecklenburg and Catawba and Iredell, so not kind of the Piedmont part of the state as well, is where we've seen this insect. This is a felt scale, which we do have felt scales that you can find on oak trees and maple trees and other species, but this is a felt scale that gets primarily on crepe myrtles. And you're going to see it on the bark as opposed to, on the undersides of the leaves that you may see in other types of scale insects. They can build up in populations really, really high, and just tons and tons of these insects right here. So these are the adults. The little white fluffy guys are the adults on the tree. When the adults, they lay their eggs. The babies that are called crawlers hatch out. They walk around, they look for a place to eat, they hunker down, they have a little mouth part like a little straw. They stick it inside the xylem of the tree, and then they just kind of hunker down and sit there and just feed on the sap and the good sugars that tree is making. And they just kind of sit there, and the crawlers will grow this little white material around the outside of its body. This little white kind of flocculent material helps protect that insect from chemicals. It's pretty thick and kind of hard to get through. They tend to be at old pruning wounds or around the base or the bark collar on these limbs right there. But once the populations get really high, they'll be found across the entire part of that tree. Because of where this insect feeds, it's called a soft scale. It's just it's like a grouping of scales. They're feeding on that material that the plant is moving up and down in that tree. Because they're feeding on it, this particular insect feeds a lot of sugars, and it releases a lot of sugar as a waste product called honeydew. And the honeydew will come out of that insect and land on the bark of the tree, and the sooty mold will grow on top of that honeydew, and that's what's causing this dark blackening of the bark that you can see all over this particular crepe myrtle right here. So the insect is harming the tree because it is feeding on that tissue where it's moving water and moving nutrients, but also that sooty mold is just a nuisance on the outside of that tree as well. Each one of these females can lay 60 to 300 eggs. So this is just a female that the little white material has been removed, and all these little tiny dots are the eggs right there. They're going to hatch into April and into May is what research has shown. So this is on a crepe myrtle branch, and you can just see how many of these little bark scales all over this particular tree. So it doesn't outright kill the crepe myrtle tree, but it does cause the vigor to be reduced of the tree. You will get a reduced number of flowers, and the clusters will be a lot smaller, and a lot of times these trees will also leaf out later. And again, the black, the sooty mold, it's not a very attractive look on that tree. There are some treatments. And since it was found in Texas, Texas A&M has done a lot of research on this particular insect, looking for different treatments and timing and when to treat these trees. They do have some recommendations. I have exclusion up here, and what this means is when you're buying plants from the nursery or for wherever you get plants, look at them and make sure that they're not infested with this crepe myrtle bark scale. So you're keeping it out of your landscape to start with. You can do some bark wash. So if you have a lot of sooty mold, you can just take a bucket with a couple gallons of water, a couple tablespoons of dish detergent like Dawn, take a brush that you might use to wash your car and just rub it up and down the trunk of that tree. You'll physically kill the scales, and then you'll also be getting some of that sooty mold off as well. And then they do recommend soil drenches with imidacloprid. Now, I'm sure everyone knows about imidacloprid in bees, this particular product, because it is a product that's taken up by the roots of the tree and move throughout the tree. It can get into the flowers and into the pollen and nectar. So you want to make sure that you use this type of product, this neonicotinoid product, when the trees are not blooming. So that's really important that if you are going to use a drench of these products, you want to do it when they are not blooming. If they are blooming and you want to do control, you're going to want to use a contact spray. My only concern with that is a bifenthrin product is a broad spectrum chemical. It's going to kill the beneficial insects and the bad insects. So just kind of be aware of that when you're looking to make management decisions for this particular insect. We have a couple other insect scales that we see. This next two that I'm going to talk about are called armored scales, and how they're different from the soft scale that I just discussed with the crepe myrtle bark scale is the armored scale. They're actually feeding inside the cells as opposed to the phloem and the xylem tissues of the tree. So with these next two insects, a systemic insecticide doesn't work really well because they're not feeding where that insecticide is moving up and down the tree. So these insects are a little bit different when it comes to control. But obscure scale, you'll find these on oak trees and hickories. They're kind of flattened little discs on the branches and on the trunk of the tree. Obscure is a good name because sometimes they can be hard to see when you're looking at it, but they're just really flat and really pressed against the side of that stem right there. So they can be a little bit difficult to see. That's just another example of it right there. Another one of the armored scales is called a gloomy scale. And this is probably one of those insects that you see on red maples if it's under any kind of stressful condition. If it's a red maple in a parking lot or a red maple in a small planting strip or if you just come to Uptown Charlotte and look at any of our red maples, you'll find these gloomy scales all over them. Trees that are under stress are more likely to be attacked by scales, so they really do like these stress trees. The gloomy scales look kind of similar to that obscure scale. It's going to be a little bit more raised than the obscure scale, and a lot of times you'll see this little white disc that's on the very tippy top. But you can run your hand up the side of the gloomy scale. It just looks like little kind of brownish pimples sitting on the side of that tree right there. When it comes to managing scales, you know, I always like to tell people to encourage your beneficials, encourage your predators. And what I mean by that is don't use broad spectrum chemicals when you don't have to. Those broad spectrums, like the bifenthrin or the sevens and onyx, not onyx, I'm sorry, orthene, they are going to kill the good insects and the bad insects as well. So just be mindful of if you're using chemicals in your landscape of what you're actually using. Targeting the crawler stage, those babies that are coming out from underneath the scales when they're moving around and looking for a place to settle down and start feeding, that's a really good life stage to target using a dormant oil, using a horticultural oil. These insects at the crawlers, before they get anything on the outside of their body, so these chemicals tend to go there and kind of smother them. I mentioned ambrosia beetles in the beginning. Ambrosia beetles are one of those insects that can be a little bit tricky to control, to be honest with you. There's a lot of different species that are native. We have some that are not native that have been brought into the United States. And again, they really like stressed trees. They really like that tree that's under stress. I mentioned before that a tree under stress will release ethanol, and that is the one thing that attracts these. In fact, when we trap, when entomologists or foresters put out traps for ambrosia beetles, that's what we use. We use ethanol. A homemade trap, you can use just plain old hand sanitizer inside of it. In the springtime, if you sit outside with a beer, a lot of times you'll get ambrosia beetles flying to you as well. So they're kind of cute little guys, I'll be honest with you. But they do carry a fungus, which is what makes them a little bit tricky. Let's see if there we go. Okay, so this is just an example of a black twig borer. So what they do is they get into a tree, all ambrosia beetles, they'll bore into the tree, and they carry a fungus either on their body, or some of them have specialized little pouches to carry the spores of the fungus. So they make tunnels inside of the tree, and those spores will come out, and they're growing inside there. So they carry the spores because that's what the babies and the adult beetles eat. These beetles aren't actually feeding on wood. They're actually feeding on the fungus that they are bringing in and kind of farming inside of the tree. And what that fungus does is it grows inside the tree, and it's going to block the xylem and the phloem, that vascular tissue that's moving things around. A lot of times it's going to block the xylem. It's not going to let water come up, and the tree is going to wilt. This particular picture was taken by the Georgia Forestry Commission. This is in a red bay tree. So here are the tunnels with the fungus growing inside of this red bay tree. This is a particular disease called laurel wilt disease. If you're on the coast of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, you've probably heard of this particular disease. It's been devastating to the red bays on the coast of those states. Another really common beetle that we see in the landscape is the granulate ambrosia beetle. I love these pictures. They're fantastic, but they don't really give you a great idea of size. I have a picture of one on my hand, but they're kind of lighter tan. This is the eyes right there, the head part of the body. It's kind of lighter tan, and they kind of move to like a chocolatey brown color. This back part of the wing right here, if you ever look at this from the top, it looks like a really dull matte color as opposed to the rest of the beetle that's super duper shiny. There it is in my hand. So it's a really, really small little insect. I actually think this is one that I caught that was trying to enter my beer can one day. But this very backside right there is where the little matte color is. But it's super duper shiny and then really dull right there at the backside of the body. These guys will attack a lot of different species of plants. Crepe myrtles that are topped I will always see these in there. Sweet gums, red bay, I've seen them in Confederate rose, oaks, pecans. They really attack a wide variety of plants. Because they want that fungus to grow inside those tunnels that they've made, they push out the chewed wood. Remember, they're not eating that wood, they're just chewing it up to make tunnels. They like to keep their tunnels super clean, so they'll push out these little strings of wood. I've always called them toothpicks. I had someone call it a noodle, which, kind of looks like a spaghetti noodle sticking out the side of the tree. So this is where the hole was, and they're keeping their tunnels super duper clean so that fungus can be able to grow inside that tree. Like I said, they like stress trees. They're attracted to ethanol. A lot of bark beetles and other beetles other ambrosia beetles, they will become active in the early spring. I always like to think of when the dogwoods start blooming. That's when a lot of our beetles, our bark beetles, start getting active, like southern pine beetle and Apes bark beetles and other things like that. North Carolina State did a study of plants in nurseries, and they found that plants in nurseries that have a really high moisture, the pots have a greater than 50% soil moisture, were more likely to be attacked by this particular granulate ambrosia beetle. So trees that are under water stress, too much water, is a really good candidate to be attacked by these insects. I thought that was pretty neat little study that they did. Oh gosh, sorry about that. So for managing for ambrosia beetles, try to keep your trees healthy, avoiding stress, getting rid of any kind of breeding site. So if you have a tree or a limb that's infested, go ahead and get rid of that, take it out of the landscape completely. These guys will go from egg to adult in about 25 days. So it's pretty quick so they can build up their populations into an area. Pine bark beetles, I see these occasionally. I actually visited someone on Monday that had some bark beetles in their pine trees. A couple different types that we see. These are called Apes beetles, southern pine beetle, which I generally don't see in an urban area unless you're near like a large tract of pine stands or like a national forest or something. And then black turpentine beetle. I'll go through these kind of quickly. Black turpentine beetle is going to be in the lower 15% of the tree. 15 feet of the tree. So pretty low is where these guys attack. The pitch tubes, which are the little globs of resin on the side of the tree, we call those pitch tubes in forestry, about the size of a quarter. This is just a picture of it. On a good day, I'm 5'4", but this is about my eye level. So they're pretty low. Usually 6 feet and below is where I'm going to see these. Sometimes they're going to be right at the ground level as well. This is just the tunnel that the female has made. She just bores down in and lays the eggs, and the little babies hatch, and they're feeding on the wood. Apes beetles, Apes bark beetles, there's 3 different species. They like stress trees that's been struck by lightning, a pine tree. These are all in pine trees, I should have mentioned that. A pine tree that's been struck by lightning will often get these Apes beetles inside of their trees. Their little pitch tubes are smaller because the beetles are physically smaller, and they're usually going to be on the plate of a pine. So if you think about the bark of a pine, they're these like irregular little plates. It's usually going to be on the plate of the tree, where the black turpentine beetle is going to kind of be in the edges in between those little plates right there. If you were to take off the bark of the tree, these Apes make tunnels called galleries that are in the shape of an X or in the shape of a Y. That's a really good way to identify these particular insects. And this is just a tree right here that the top has been killed by an Apes beetle. You might just get the very tippy top of the tree to die, and the whole thing will go down. In a forest of stands, you'll just get little pockets of dead trees scattered about, where if it were southern pine beetle, all of these trees would be like a whole area of trees that would be killed. So generally don't see southern pine beetle in urban areas unless you're near a pretty large tract of forest. Pine sawyer, this is a secondary insect. I couldn't get the sound to work, but that's okay. If you're ever out in the woods and you hear in a tree, that's the babies of the pine sawyer beetle eating that tree. They're getting in the tree when it's basically dead is a good way to think about it. So that's just the grub right there. Hopefully everyone's heard of emerald ash borer. It's in a lot of areas in North Carolina, not native to the United States. brought into the Detroit, Michigan area. And this map is from this July, so just a couple days ago is the update. Go back to that. The area in blue is quarantined. The little red dots are positive areas where they've detected emerald ash borer. So a lot of different counties in North Carolina. It's definitely in Charlotte, lots of different areas. They do only attack ash trees. Up in Ohio, they have been found in fringe tree, Kyananthus, but we're not sure what's going to happen in the southeast. I'm not sure that it's been found in North Carolina in that native fringe tree, or Grancy graybeard is another common name for it. But they do attack all of the 4 species of ash trees. The beetle can fly about half mile, 3, maybe 5 miles all by itself. The beetles are active this time of year, usually in May through July is when they're going to be active. They do eat the leaves, but they're not really causing damage to the leaves very much. It's not like a caterpillar defoliation. They lay eggs on kind of in between the little bark plates of the tree. You usually don't see the eggs unless you're kind of taking it apart. The grub is what's causing the problem. So this little larva is tunneling, it's chewing through that cambium tissue and eating that wood and disrupting the water and nutrient flow. It's actually etched in right there. They exit through D-shaped exit holes. So they're, hopefully I don't think I have my pointer on anymore. But they're flat on the bottom and rounded on the top, so the letter D-shaped exit holes. And these are the tunnels that the larvae are making. So that's what's disrupting the tree and causing that tree to die. So the tree will start declining. Usually it will die from the top. It'll start thinning out. A large tree may take 5 years to die. A smaller tree may die within just a couple years of being attacked by these insects. Woodpeckers love to feed on the pupa and the larva underneath the bark, and so they'll rip through and have large areas. As opposed to that yellow-bellied sapsucker I showed you in the beginning that were just little dots going across, you'll actually see the bark that's ripped open. We call that blonding, where you can see just the lighter wood underneath of the tree, where those woodpeckers have been getting in there trying to find these insects. There are a lot of treatments. There are a lot of treatments that can be used for soil injection, trunk sprays, trunk injections. There are a lot of chemicals out there that are labeled for management. As long as the tree has less than 50% of the canopy that has died, so if it has more than half of its canopy, you can use a chemical to treat it. If emerald ash borer has been found within 15 to 20 miles of where you live, you can do treatments proactively before the insect gets inside there. Some of these chemicals, like a soil drench, you may have to use annually, the imidacloprid. If you do a trunk injection with the MMX benzoate, they're seeing definitely 2, potentially 3 years control. So this is an insect that is managed. My one shade tree in my backyard is an ash tree. It's about 24 inches, and I'm going to treat that tree every single 2 years, probably 2 to 3 years. I'm going to continue to treat that tree because that's the shade on my house. Otherwise, the trees will die and they'll have to be removed. This is just pictures of what the trapping looks like to capture these insects. One of my favorite cartoons. It's being moved by people. If you saw on the map, it's way out in Colorado. That insect is not flying from Michigan to Colorado. It is moving by people. So, big push in the Carolinas is to not move firewood outside of about a 20 to 25-mile radius from where you live. Lots of insects and diseases you can move to other areas. So we don't want to move firewood. That's my soapbox for the day. Some root rot. I'd like to talk a little bit about these. We do have some diseases that do affect trees. Sometimes diseases might be like a lesion on the leaf that may not cause a problem long-term for those trees. They just look really bad. But there are some fungi that do cause issues for trees. So I'll talk about a couple of the major root rot diseases that I see in trees. I talked earlier about, trying to look at symptoms and looking at the health of the tree. Some of the symptoms with these root rot disease, such as thinning crown or yellowing or stunted growth or dieback, there's a lot of insects that cause damage that might cause the same kind of thing. A tree that's just stressed for water, either too much or too little, you might get some thinning as well as those roots start dying if it's, sitting in water for too long. So a lot of the symptoms aren't really characteristic of a particular root rot disease. In willow oaks, we have a lot of willow oaks in Charlotte. We get a particular disease called innonotus root rot, and this is what the mushroom of this particular fungus looks like. And so this particular fungus causes a white rot disease of the roots and the roots and the bottom part of the trunk of the tree. And this is just, the mushroom is just the reproductive structure. The fungus is actually causing the damage to the wood is inside of the wood. So a lot of times I'll get homeowners that will remove these mushrooms thinking that they're helping to get rid of that disease, but the disease is actually inside of the wood of the tree. So just taking off the mushroom really doesn't do anything. It takes it away, so you're not physically seeing it, but it's not stopping that particular disease from stopping. So this innonotus root rot gets inside of the wood of the roots of the tree, and it feeds on those roots and weakens the roots, and that tree is susceptible to windfall because the structural roots are rotted away, basically. This particular fungus, I always think it kind of looks like whole wheat pizza dough. It's kind of weird and bumpy. It'll have these little resin spots on the outside when they're young and fresh. They kind of look velvety from the top. As they kind of age, eventually they'll turn black, and it kind of looks like cracked asphalt. And you'll see that in the wintertime. And this is just more of that mushroom that's growing right there. So this is something to be aware of, especially when you see these mushrooms. We call them conks, C-O-N-K-S. That's another name. When you start seeing a lot of conks around the outside of this tree, this is a good tree to take a mallet and to sound and see if you're hearing any hollow areas in this root tissue and even up into the butt of the tree as well. This particular tree, so I've got this innonotus mushroom right here, and I also have these patches where the bark has come off. This is caused by hypoxylon canker, which I'll talk about too. But sometimes on a tree that's pretty heavily infested with root rot, sometimes you'll see more than one different type of root rot along the base of the tree. So this is another innonotus conk. There's some old right there that kind of looks like asphalt along the side. And then we've got a secondary mushroom right there that's called Ganoderma. There's several different species. Causes a rot of roots in the lower bottom of the trunk. The ones when they're fresh, they can look really bright and shiny. So some of the symptoms, this is an oak tree. You can see I've got top dieback. I've got a lot of dead tissue right up here. And it's dying from the top down because, remember, those roots are being affected. So the tree isn't able to move water up into the tree. It's probably not taking as much, so the top of the tree is going to die. We generally see that with root issues as you get kind of this little top dieback right there when that tree is not moving water efficiently. And this is what the Ganoderma mushroom looks like. So it can be bright, kind of like a Chinese red color, very, very shiny and creamy and white on the bottom. And here's another one that's actually on a cherry tree, so it's nice and bright and varnished looking on the top. Lots of different types of forms. This one was just coming up through a little bed of pine straw, just new. So look for this kind of varnishy kind of color right there to be able to identify this particular mushroom. This was on a tree. It's kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see the varnished areas right here and right here. This was on a tree in the parking lot of a big box store where I used to work in South Carolina, and this is my work truck. I parked next to it, and I was like, what is happening here? So it had all this root rot around the base of the tree. My only guess for the reason that this tree is cut like it is the top probably died, and instead of just removing this tree, they just cut out the dead material. Long term, not really going to help that tree. But all throughout the entire parking lot, all their trees look like this, and you can see the nice big volcano mulching that's just causing issues with the roots of those trees. Another mushroom that's out right now is called armillaria, or honey mushroom is another name for it. Again, it's causing a root rot disease. It will attack weakened plants and older plants. Lots of different species that armillaria will get into. This was taken at the base of a willow oak tree. So all these little clumps of these mushrooms are the armillaria, the honey mushroom, all around the base of that tree right there. So these roots that are out here are old and rotting. A lot of times you'll see these pop up when a tree's been removed. You'll see these clumps of mushrooms pop up for a couple years after that tree's been gone. So if you see this on a living tree, just be aware that there's something going on with the roots of that tree, just to have awareness of that. It can be aggressive. It will get into dead tissue, which is good, which is what we want the mushrooms to do, but a lot of times it will also attack living tissue. This is a tree that picture was taken by one of my former coworkers that I used to work with at the Forestry Commission. And you can just see, this probably wasn't only armillaria, but there's armillaria on this tree. It got up into the butt of that tree, and there's just nothing structurally holding this tree here. The last one, hypoxylon canker. I showed you a picture earlier. It gets into a lot of different types of trees, hardwood trees.
What now?
It'll kill trees usually when trees are really stressed.
Ooh.
That's when the fungus will start growing and cause damage to these trees long term. So what you want to look for on these trees is you'll have patches where the bark has come off on the tree, and then you'll be able to see the fungus living underneath of it. This is a willow oak. I'm looking at pretty high in this picture, but you can see these patches. Once you start seeing these areas where the bark has come off on this tree, the tree tends to, or at least the branch where it's growing, it'll decline really, really quickly. This is obviously in a wooded area. This is on a white oak tree. The tree had the hypoxylon on the main branch. And you can see sometimes it's kind of a silvery, sometimes it's kind of a brown color, just depending on if the spores are active or not. But the bark is going to pop off. So you'll probably see hunks of bark around the base of the tree. Showed you that picture earlier. But you can see, just these little patches where the hypoxylon is growing inside there. So sometimes it's just bright silvery. Sometimes it'll kind of look black at certain times of the year. Sometimes it'll look kind of brownish, like a little fawn color. So with these different root rot diseases that I just talked about, there's really no cure. Once that tree is infected, it's infected. Removing the mushroom isn't going to do anything. So you really need to look at that tree and pay a lot of attention to it. Look at the overall health of the tree, sound those roots with a mallet to make sure you don't have a lot of hollow areas, and keep track of that tree. Really monitor that over a period of time. If it's, when we think about tree risk assessment, we always talk about, is there a target? So that tree in the woods, that white oak tree in the woods that had hypoxylon on it, it's in the middle of a I think it was about a 50-acre stand. There was not a target there. So that kind of tree, the person would just let die and just let go, no problem. However, if that tree was in someone's backyard, 25, 30 feet from their house, they're not really moving that target. So you got to think about any kind of management that you need to do. There's no chemicals that you're going to be able to use to kill root rot, what's inside of the tree. And sometimes you may just have to remove and replace that tree. Sometimes you just get so much damage, so much disease that you just can't keep that tree long term. So I always like to start my presentation with kind of my take-home message. So here's my take-home message again. Try to do prevention. When you have insects or diseases that may harm trees, try to think about prevention. Planting those trees properly, getting good stock, making sure you have the right tree in the right site, the right tree in that right kind of soil, very important. Taking care of that tree, whether it's proper watering, making sure you have mulch. Again, mulch is great because it keeps lawnmowers and weed trimmers away from the trunk of the tree. It also helps to regulate the water and the temperature in the soils, puts nutrients back in. Remember, weed and feed. It's not always a friend to trees, more a friend to grass than anything. And keep an eye on your plants. Always look out, see if there's something new, see if there's something different. And again, don't be afraid to consult a professional, someone that knows. Plant Problem Clinic, NC State has a great one. You can send samples off. They'll identify and give options. I'm not sure where everyone's from, but I went to Clemson. I used to work in South Carolina. So, the Clemson University, your land-grant colleges are going to have some sort of diagnostic lab that you can send samples to. Same thing with soil samples. I mentioned fertilization, but you may not need to fertilize trees as often as people think you do. So getting a soil sample and knowing if your pH is proper and your trees are able to accept all the nutrients that are in the soil, or if you need to add certain things, is always a good idea as well. So I love this little ad, found in firewood, buy local. Don't move firewood. We don't want to move any kind of insects around to different areas. This is my contact information, my email address. That's my cell phone number. I love getting pictures. I love answering questions, so feel free. But I'll end now, Leslie, if there's any questions that anyone has. I'm not sure where the chat window is, so.
Yeah, so we are now, thank you so much, Lori. We're now at the part where we can probably take a couple of questions. You want to type your question into the chat dialog box and submit it, and we'll kind of work our way through that way. We did have a couple of questions that came through as you were doing your presentation. And I think one goes back from Holly Springs asking about Gloomy Scale on maples, and if that will kill the trees or not.
Yeah.
And what they need to do.
Sure, yeah. So they just add to the stress of the tree. It's something they can live with, but long term, it's just something extra on top of that tree. So whenever I think about like insects causing a problem for trees, it's not just the one thing, right? It just kind of builds, and you add on to it, and you add on to it, and eventually there's going to be a straw that's going to break the camel's back. And for a scale, that's usually something that's not going to outright kill the tree. It might be something to think about, maybe using some horticultural oils or something, and, making sure that they actually are active still. A lot of times I'll go up to red maples and I just kind of take my fingernail and just kind of scrape across. The scales that are alive will kind of be gooey, and the ones that are dead will just flake off. So sometimes, those old skins will just kind of hang on there even if it's not an active infestation. That answer? I hope that answers the question.
I think it did.
Okay.
And then, so if anybody else has any other questions, we'll kind of give you guys a couple minutes to do that. This presentation is being recorded, so once it gets processed and everything, I'll try and have it up on our YouTube channel probably next week or so. So if you want to share this with anybody else in the future, you can always go back and send them. And I'll email the link out to all the attendees to today's webinar. Up on the screen now is the ISA certification code for the education credit. We were approved for 1 credit hour. So if you take note of the code, then you'll do a self-reporting form and submit that to ISA so you get credit for this, for attending today's webinar. But I haven't seen any other questions come in. You did a great job with everything, Lori, so it's a lot of stuff to go on. I think you probably could have done a full day of insects and pests for urban trees and not run out of content.
There's so much out there, yep.
But I also wanted to draw everybody's attention to, we do have 2 more webinars in our 2019 webinar series coming up in October and November. We'll send out announcements for those, but our topics are going to be tree canopy assessments and then proper tree care practices. So keep an eye out for those as they come across the board, and hopefully we'll have you at those. We did get one more question, how does the volcano mulching affect trees? If you want to maybe mention a couple of issues with the volcano mulching.
Sure. So that volcano mulching, what it does basically is roots need oxygen as well. So what happens is as you pile it up, you're kind of reducing the amount of oxygen to the roots that are actually in the ground. what also happens is I mentioned that mulch is great because it holds moisture and, regulates temperature. So it's holding that moisture there. So those roots that are in the ground have a lesser oxygen. So the tree is going to want to grow more roots. And those roots, instead of growing from where they should, they're growing from the bark of the tree, the trunk of the tree. And so they're going to come out into that area just because it needs oxygen. It's a little bit wetter, and so it's going to grow into there. So the roots that are in the ground that are stabilizing the tree, they're reduced oxygen, they may start dying as well. And so you have your roots up in that volcano area. Does that make sense, I hope, Leslie?
Yes. Yeah, so
Okay,
you're not going to get the structural integrity. You're not going to get the structural roots that are needed to support those trees. They're not going to be growing in the soil. They're going to be in that nice, moist, airy mulch and not doing too much good for the tree itself.
Right, exactly.